Hello everyone, today we talk about medieval sling warfare and the apparent continuity that this had in the region of Castile and more in general the Iberian Peninsula. That was definitely not the only region in Europe having congress amount of slingers in their ranks, but as we will understand now, aside from the strictly Iberian evidence, there is a sort of bigger picture to draw regarding the development of sling warfare from the ancient times to the Middle Ages. This is in fact not the first video I make on slingers. I surely discussed this, I think, in the very early days of Schwerpunkt as far as Hellenic warfare was concerned. There is all a matter of, say, broader warfare, but meant like who were the slingers, right? What was their background? What did happen throughout the medieval millennium that differed in some ways from the previous times? Naturally, in later times you have firearms taking over, but already during the Middle Ages, as we will understand now, essentially the development of the crossbow, for example, rendered useless troops used with other missile weapons in practice were, however, superfluous, right? So that's where we must start digging in the first place. Well, the first thing I can say, there is a debate regarding the effectiveness of sling warfare, also as far as the ancient world is concerned. And don't get me wrong, actually in the ancient world, notoriously, slingers, and particularly at least some from particular areas, think about the Balearic Islands, Rhodes, etc., were particularly famous, right, for their effectiveness, their lethality as well, especially their anti-armor function. Essentially, you have a blunt trauma against you that can, bleed people wide from the within, right, with internal hemorrhages and so on. There is definitely a broader primitiveness and effectiveness of certain type of, in fact, archaic, simpler type of warfare throughout the Middle Ages in the forms of literal stones that were, for example, loaded on a regular basis as sort of ammo for especially the defense, but also the attack. That in the latter case through artillery, also non-gunpowder one, in siege warfare, right, to defend castles primarily. And you have, in fact, archaic weapons like javelins proper that in even particularly advanced late medieval warfare you still see being extremely effective against armor, and or at least the joints of plate armor that was worn especially by the men-at-arms that were used on a regular basis as stormtroopers while, in fact, trying to storm the enemy battlements. That's something that, you see, I'm very critical, as you know, of the military revolution. So there is this general technologistic, modernistic bias for which infantry in the later Middle Ages sort of boomed for some reason. That's actually not the case. That's true only from a certain type of settled national warfare emerging from the mid-15th century, which is another story compared to the actual everyday guy. And this topic is actually connected closely with the demise of the sling, even in previous times, right? Even at the moment of the rise of feudal monarchies. And the point I was making, that I forgot, so that in siege warfare, commoners were the bigger deal. Of course, it was important to numerically, and being able to encircle the enemy fortress, etc. But still, the protagonism in siege warfare, as much as in open field, was, of course, incarnated by the men-at-arms. Right? This is true many times in history. I mean, the guys that especially are so individually overloaded, aside from their traumatic collective training and effectiveness, which is by far way more important than their individual training in terms of practical results, is in this war the only one that can perform in certain, even just the athletic feats of just climbing a ladder under fire against these guys throwing stones, literal, boulders at you, while trying to climb them in armor with all the adrenaline, with the actual emotional control that these guys specifically had and were trained for in the first place, etc. And as a consequence, as you understand, also the attention is much more focused on these guys. Not because, yes, there was a sort of bias against the commoners, but in medieval literature, like in feudal culture, but not to the extent that actually this was hiding, concealing some sort of, again, of much greater development of commoners and thus mostly infantry capabilities compared to what it actually existed. I mean, I study specifically infantry, I mean, not quite specifically because it's always part of combined arms, and I like to stress that, but my academic production focuses on the power of infantry in the areas where this was actually the strongest in Europe, and that was a bit the exception, if you want, to the rest. So overall, and even the exception there is not so, leagues apart from the rest of, the continental average. Europeans fundamentally fought in the West, especially at this point, pretty much in the same way, starting especially from the 14th century. Like the local ethnic divides have, even if they had constituted some shades at some point, especially out of the post-Carolingian originary ring, let's say, these are flattened, right? But I thought that, in fact, this focus on Castilian slingers, as much as sling warfare in general at this point, can be quite instructive to exemplify how and why we do know, for example, about these Iberian missile troops, as opposed to other areas in Europe in which we're practically sure that there was a big deal of sling warfare, or at least one that would still make for a relevant one, but may have been a less developed area, or one that was more not necessarily feudally dominated. Again, if these guys had been important, the sources would have documented them. It's a bit like in the video about Hellenic slingers. We have created, again, as moderns, artificially, and just like in the last generations, this idea that in fact is going to be remodulated at this point a bit better, fortunately, because not all historiography is bad at all, of classical Hellenic warfare, just, again, heavy infantry in a perfectly squared phalanx and nothing else, right? Even though we know, of course, that there are cavalrymen, there are slingers, there are missile troops, but mostly still sticking around that cause. But if you look at all Hellenic warfare, you realize not just you find these guys with a certain frequency, but they sort of have, especially if you read Tyrtaeus, some of probably the oldest, the archaic period, like probably an archetypal role next to the hero, right? And in fact, it's not quite just the average peasant soldier, right? In the anonymous, right, phalangite ranks, right? Just at least in an aseptic, neutral sense. That story wasn't in fact how we described it, at least in that categorical sense. And here it's a bit the same. The question is, why do we have more evidence of Iberian sling warfare for the later Middle Ages? That's something we will try to explain a bit better now, right? But to make the long story short, at least about the premise of why, and it's again a very generalistic explanation, like slings were apparently less used, and also documented, which is not necessarily the same thing, but it does match in this case, is that the sling was a peasant weapon, right? And the peasants had normally the battlefield precluded to them. Now, I don't like to term it in this way because, as you know, I was a peasant, and was a soldier, was a levy, etc. there's no doubt that vast areas of Europe were sort of demilitarized by the feudal system, that at least the masses, right, for that were working, in fact, for these ultra elite guys, in fact, to do the aforementioned men-at-arms role. But it is true, of course, that warfare was not just about this quite tightly regulated system that populations could rebel. And if you talk about the 14th century, think about the Jacquerie and other disorders in Europe and so on. But we're talking also of peasants. They're not necessarily, for example, shepherds or people that were just habituated to, for example, eat from hunting prey with taken down with a sling, as much as it could be, say, in other areas of the and times in history. Like why, for example, the Balearic slingers or the ones of Rhodes are more famous. These people were piratic shepherds in their homeland. They had some sort of, also strategical and political relevance, as far as the fact that they lived in islands that could be somehow protected, even though they were harassed. They had been harassed historically by their kings, etc. You don't hear too much about, I don't know, the formidable Celtic slingers, but of course the entire Europe was filled with large swaths of Celtic slingers that would have been actually good in their own way. At least slingers would have constituted, just like missile troops, so light troops in the first place, the weakest, of course, of the entire armies, right? That were, of course, made in the decisive element by, at that time, heavy infantry. In medieval times, we have the preponderance of heavy cavalry, and surely you cannot take down, especially in open field. That is actually, however, the only place where you can really use slingers, can you? Like, with a crossbow, you can, you can't really shoot from very tight windows from the battlements. You can't even shoot a lane on the ground. With a sling, you need more space. You need sort of more flexibility. But in that case, not even longbowmen or crossbowmen technically can't do anything about a cavalry charge. I mean, at best they can try to slow it down, to disorder it, but the decisive element without which these people would be completely exterminated, of course, is the heavies, right? Whether mounted or dismounted men-at-arms, especially in this period. We talk about the 14th century here because I had to pick different evidence. I mean, there is actually evidence about 13th century, 15th century slingers, also from areas like Castile. Today we stick to the 14th just to be more precise, because there is a relevant amount of information that we can squeeze into this guy here. And in fact, the 14th century has its own particular bias in of itself, right? So aside from approximation, it's obvious that in Europe you would have, for example, still in the Celtic fringe, I don't know, among the Irish, we were talking about it recently, as far as those regional series about, in fact, local warfare, as broader introduction to the point. But there was an incredibly poor material culture, and the sling was still there, right, in a sort of normal way. The majority of peasants or commoners that would have picked, weapons in their actually often, usual participation to some degree of violence, would have preferred a crossbow, right? It's much easier and faster, especially in areas where you can easily actually create crossbows existed even in the early medieval picked land, right? So it's not really this per se extremely sophisticated weapon. This had just re-boomed in the high Middle Ages, not because they had to reinvent the crossbow that had existed since antiquity throughout the entire period everywhere, independently from how often we document it. But as we see here in some of even of the most backward areas of Europe, it is all about the social background of these guys. Is how many people you can arm with sort of easy weapons to use, even in emergential conditions. These troops that we see here were not savages necessarily from the mountains living an anarchic lifestyle. They were, of course, under some lords that also provided in part for their own equipment. And of course, as we were saying before, missile infantry, doesn't matter how numerous it is, it's not able to tackle the heavies, whether on foot and especially on horseback, right? So that's kind of a quick, cheap, effective weapon you can provide large amounts of people with a minimal training, with a minimal care. Don't get me wrong. Also, crossbows, especially their ammo, did cost, did have an impact economically, whatever. And communities, generally speaking, were armed, right? When you talk about demilitarization, mostly like the idea that these guys were cut out from a sort of a professional military lifestyle, the possibility of building some sort, also because they didn't have the capacity of doing so as commoners, like especially more as peasants, to having deep, say, long-range connections to complex political, social bodies. No, right? This is exactly the century in which the peasants go under for good, and if you want to see them up again, just wait for half of a millennium. This is when actually the commoners and the infantries of commoners go down. Never confuse the pike squares started from the Swiss and copied by the other Europeans as these were armies of commoners. They were armies of proletarians armed and ruled over with iron fist by major powers, right? Princes, mostly the Swiss are a bit the exception, that in fact doesn't quite evolve beyond much to the pike square itself and doesn't quite venture into a successful imperialistic dimension. But of course the Germans, the Spanish, the French, everybody, and eventually Renaissance warfare implements this further in a much bulkier way that only a massive state had provided. You do not find historically eventually commoners' armies that do anything relevant anymore, right? The citizen soldier is a completely different thing, starting with mass society ruled over by the state, right? Not just this sort of some corporatistic sum of communities like it actually was in the Middle Ages, when we can still talk about some, of course, statual dimension. So what we're seeing here is ever more interesting in the sense that this is actually the time in which troops like also slingers, or this sort of evidently more accustomed, say, people more accustomed to some sort of individual weapon use for personal needs, would have not really been that common anymore, right? So one reason why we see these troops in Castilla, as we'll see now, may be easily the fact that in the vastity of Spain, that also did have some mountainous areas, sort of more backwards one, especially in the north, in fact, but that was not so populated, especially because of the Reconquista sort of frontier areas that had been formed. There wasn't such necessarily a thick control. There would be some shepherd communities that had maintained still, yes, under the local lords and whatever, some greater, sort of more primitive lifestyle, and or, exactly because of that, because this is typical actually of 14th century mercenaries, would be more likely from this fringe to go on being mercenaries, right, serving abroad. And we will see it now. This is typical again of, for example, extremely rough primitive infantry, like think about the Amogalvares or the Bidot, coming literally from the most depressed areas of the Iberian Peninsula and being effective. Why? Because they had such sophisticated or effective weapons, or were such special types of units or whatever. No, it's just because they were incredibly primitive, rough, violent, hungry, and as such they had a moral load that in the right hands, even in this auxiliary and supportive roles, could turn out to be useful. Think about the 100 Years' War, right? And how much of that was made of chevauché. This is not the case. I mean, slingers on horseback are a bit adventurous as a concept. Of course, they wouldn't. But you do have horse archery. And there is this sense, I don't know why. I've read it in multiple books, especially the ones, the divulgation and, from the Anglosphere and about Western warfare, that there weren't, like in Western Europe, horse archers, mounted crossbowmen, something like that. They were playing, like they're extensively documented, of course, as some, contained units numerically, but they were a thing. They were normal. They were what actually from the 12th, 13th century, lots of people would use, and also in areas that are sort of, I found a lot of them, for example, in the southeastern German, sort of Slavic Hungarian frontier. There's plenty of them. Mounted crossbowmen, for example. Admittedly, yes, the West had a much sort of bulkier way of war. I mean, just like today, like the most hyper-loaded heavies that really smash hard in open field and everything. And so at the time, of course, as we were like today, the lighter element doesn't quite find much of a room, also because it's a civilized area overall, right? And so civilized people do not fight as slingers, nor leave as that for a living, generally speaking. But of course, like throughout all of Europe, we have seen it for the Celtic Fringe, we've seen it for this area of northern Spain, we've seen it for especially all the mountaineers communities scattered in Europe, from the Swiss, from the Apennine community. Like you do find the brutal mountaineers that go out where fighting, and they are lots of different people. The Iberian Peninsula, if anything, is characterized apparently by some last sort of hit-and-run tactic bias, like it's the alla Gineta fighting, right? That stemmed in part, but actually it was a very Iberian thing since antiquity, as you know, but in part also as you'll see now, the Arabs, they in fact do display some slingers among them, have in the Emirate of Granada, pretty late in time still, sort of would maintain the Christian Iberians were heavier, bulkier again than their Islamic Andalusian and North African counterparts. But they had maintained and made several videos about Spanish warfare at this point during the Reconquista, that sense of sort of lighter harasser and whatever. And the reasons are many. There is a bit, it's the extent of the country, the idea of long-range warfare offensives, the idea of this great empty spaces. Spain is like, think about the Central Plateau, and you have all these hills. This was the nightmare of whoever ever fought there, right, from ancient times to contemporaries. In some even semi-desertic areas that basically harass constantly one another with poor resources but heavy fortification. And there is a lot of pastoralism. In late medieval Spain, those areas that had for centuries remained depopulated, not because they would have not been fertile or agriculturally developable. They have actually been in Roman, even Arab times, but with the Reconquista they had become unsafe. The local farms had been destroyed, etc. So these were filled by shepherds in the colder season due to transhumance. Castile had by far the largest wool production in late medieval Europe, right? The second one was one of the Kingdom of Naples that was just a fraction of that. And so you can easily understand shepherd-slinger, that duo that comes, in fact, to be apparent, like in the connections of these people's lifestyle and so sort of preferred weapons, and that sort of explains a bit the picture. Again, the these pastoral areas were, today we talk about Castile in general. I was thinking most about the northern part of the country that, in fact, is sort of consonant even with those other mercenaries we're talking about before. So there is nothing strictly specific about the geographical area without the Iberian Peninsula in this regard, because again, we find also the Grenadines using, right? We have from Ibn Udail that Grenadine slingers were there in the 14th century. There is an incident mentioning them as late as 1459. So definitely, this is, again, if you had gone in any other European country, you would have found touring around a slinger, right? It would have not been so strange after all. But it would have been much more likely to find one in, first of all, sort of pastoral areas, and especially some in which, you know, the social development, in fact, was not that great. There was some sort of frontier warfare, and the let's say the inclination of some local troops to even sell their services out of desperation, of poverty, and with this very local poor weapons. Consider this aspect about what we're telling before regarding this lifestyle. I'd say, but these guys would have, you know, if they wanted to serve abroad, couldn't they fight with another weapon at that point? They would, right? But there is some accustomation to your own traditional fighting style. I mean, if you're very, very good with a sling, we will see what they could do now with this. Why, after all, you know, fighting with another weapon? Yes, it's a matter of personal defense, whatever, but the point of these guys was exactly this one. They were cheap, right? They were hungry, they were poor, so you could easily hire them, giving them some little extra more than perhaps what they even deserve to have them them with you if they were particularly good at using that kind of weapon. But you didn't need to give them, I don't know, some armor, some metal armor, heavy gear, whatever. You would use them just in this sort of hit and run dimension as skirmishers during the battle, and that would not weigh excessively on your supplies and your logistics and all this stuff. And this would have been also, in fact, on the field tactically, sort of flat troops that would screen a bit the enemy, like would allow other troops to prepare better for combat, and again, wouldn't cost that much. And this was present all over, right? You can argue again what I said before, that the crossbow was sort of rendering obsolete any other kind of a missile weapon. Also, firearms were, at least at an individual level, the, let's say, firearms would have been spreading from this point and onwards, even though they sort of became relevant as handguns only in the second half of the 14th century. But in fact, this is the point. If you had pockets of these guys that were there, you could use them. You could make them fight that particular way they were, that they would have not added too much to the overall tactical balance, but maybe 50 shepherds equipped with slings were better than, in terms of combativeness, in habituation to killing people and whatever, better than 50 levy peasants that were sort of scared and, you know, just taken from the field, and to whom you had given crossbows, right? So it's on average, like, you wouldn't necessarily have these extremes in terms of moral background and sort of even habituation to violence. But in these areas, it would have been sort of easier to find such combative slingers than in other places. And again, it's not much of a compliment to the broader background as such. The point actually is that Spain was, especially the continental part, dominated largely by Castile, it was again one of the most powerful feudal states in Europe, but largely also because the local communities were not particularly overdeveloped. Like the population was sparse compared to other areas of Europe. It was just a large realm as such that could control in absolute terms, large amounts of people, but the quality of the societal development, especially considering this was a rigidly feudal system. Yes, there were some cities, there was some, in fact, local militias, there was some dynamism, like overall, Europe was developing altogether, but still you find these pockets of archaism, right, and sort of militarization down the line. This is the concept of the end of the Reconquista, that essentially a large part of the Spanish male population were hidalgos, but as such were sort of more like a gentry, not really what they thought to be, that is, the noblemen that would fight more often like a man at arms, right? Hence, also part of the Spanish predisposition to quality infantry towards the end of the Middle Ages, the sort of brought into play like the full version of pike and shot, the affirmation of the tercio, and so the sense that as a nobleman you didn't have to be ashamed to actually start rising from the ranks as a humble pikeman, even though there are some broader implications there. Spain was not the only place where this was happening, but it had the most prominent connection in terms of what that individual still could do. And because these were militarized populations, if you want, that had been fighting as a raison d'etre and national identity until 1492, more often against actually fellow Christians, but still in the incredibly brutal competition between, in fact, Christian Iberian powers, and that, however, yet so in the expulsion of the infidel, at least the subjection of the same, as it had been more habitual within the same peninsula up to the end of the Middle Ages. If you want, that traditional perpetual struggle, right, that had channeled this war that was quite well encased within itself, after all, compared to other European, the rest of Western Europe, to that particular direction, right? One of the reasons also why we find mentions of these Iberian slingers is that, in fact, the Iberian Peninsula belonging to Western Europe had overall an important level of development, of documentation, and so for example, the Iberian monarchies are quite precociously let's say, maintaining their own archives. This is not necessarily to do with these incidents that we mostly get from narrative sources, and very often not even just from the Iberian literature, but foreign one, and that also, in fact, may be an indicator of some, in fact, more kind of French English interest. I made a video about Froissart, that is one of the sources talking about these slingers at the battles of Nayara and Valverde, for example, in 1367 and 1385, respectively. As you know, these were part of, say, local Iberian conflicts, but they are documented by such an author because they were part of the 100 Years' War, the complex relations between Castile, Portugal, France, and England, especially the necessity of the fleets that the Iberian monarchies could provide to these powers at some point through their Italian connections and so on. It tells us that something that we have observed often in our military historical videos, that the sort of more developed, documented, let's say, culture is able to document, in fact, highlight certain features that, if it had depended just on the local dimension, would have not come out, because the local dimension was sort of rougher. Because it's like saying we are extremely lucky for having had the Greeks and the Romans documenting the Celts and the Germans, because if it had depended on them, would have not had anything, right, in terms of written evidence in those times. So we know about those peoples, and we wonder about others that were not documented by classical civilization, even though they probably had very similar way of war, because until you have that explicit evidence in history, you still remain in the field of speculation. Some are better, some are worse, but this is the point. In a, say, Franco-English conflict that, say, is an approximation, speaking of the 100 Years' War, you find the French, the English, the protagonists fighting in the Iberian Peninsula, and in the stories written about them, there is a mention of who was fighting there in that battle. Well, look, these guys in Spain used slingers to an important degree, right? This is not a novelty again in the rest of Europe. Spain is not strange in this. For example, Edward I of England is recorded employing an elite unit of slingers in 1303. This has nothing to do with Spain. Like, it's an English thing, or at most a British thing. I don't know. We do not have actually info about the nationality, but as you know, the English were using, for example, lots of Welsh archers. That I already discussed. The thing doesn't tell us anything about the Welsh being better or worse archers than the English. If anything, we see that the English had actually paid their own English archers better than the Welsh ones. Again, never confuse being poor and desperate, and so becoming a soldier into a foreign army with having to do with, being superior, militarily speaking. That has absolutely nothing to do with that, right? The Welsh had surely good archers, but as much as the English had, and probably even not necessarily better than theirs, even as given the actual documentation on it. Right, so in war, you often go with what you have because it's cheap. There are also economic implications, as you know, so it's not like, the English longbowmen, were not taught how to fight by the Welsh. And the longbow is a weapon that you find all over Europe, literally every freaking where. In all the West, it's been done always in the same way. All countries used it. I will make extensive videos on all the Western European countries in the Middle Ages making relevant sound and well-documented use of longbows on a regular basis, next to naturally also the smaller ones. But in fact, that's the point, right? The longbow does not exist as a weapon. It's the same old bow that is just larger depending on who was using it. And so we do have, equally with the sling, the weapon remaining in use in some parts of Europe, especially at least until the end of the 14th century. Because after that, mostly crossbows and firearms had become so relevant that, again, these other weapons were practically obsolete. You could not compete in open ground against them, right? As we said, Froissart documents slings being used in Spain as Battle of Nayera and Valverde. In 1386, the same author tells us that John I of Castile had, quote, of infantry casting stones with slings, more than 30,000. Right? Now, this datum is very interesting for the simple fact that here we find a king of Castile, Juan I, literally issuing more than 30,000 cast stones with the specific function of sling projectiles. Right? We're, again, in 1386, this is fairly late in time. This can tell us that the Castilian army still relied to a significant degree on sling warfare, right? You do find this kind of ammo production, storing, like dictated by the monarchies at different levels, right? The aforementioned Edward I, in some video I documented this, I think the one about, I don't remember, but something about medieval artillery had the same centralized process for piling up, in fact, trebuchet shots, which apparently said early on in the 13th century in southern France was sort of more politically fragmented, were still sometimes cast on the spot which was something particularly frequent on a regular basis. I mean, surely also the English did at some point, but having this initial fresh supply could have really helped especially in the first engagements of the war. And in this case, 30,000 slingshots are properly issued by the king of Castile. Froissart, on the same battle of Nájera, I actually don't know how it's pronounced, wrote, quote, "The Spanish commonalty made use of slings to which they were accustomed and from which they threw large stones." Right? And he goes as far as saying that, regarding this weapon's effectiveness, that these commoners, quote, "threw stones with such force that they could split a helmet in half." Right? And he specifies that the English at first suffered severely from the Spanish slingers, before eventually the English longbowmen destroyed their opponents, disorganizing and routing them. Right? So this adds other interesting details. Right? First of all, that these slingers were commoners. So these are not mercenaries. We find essentially levies gathered for this major engagement that also, let's stress it, took place in northeastern Spain. So if anything, these especially lighter troops would have gathered, sometimes even on their own, with the purpose of looting, etc. There would be always this sort of lighter troops. It's like, I don't know, the Turcopoles for the Crusaders, or the Cumans for the Hungarians. We have these light troops that are sometimes even often brigands, right? Every sort of scum of the earth that were coming there, like just to, get something out of the loot, and were just to harass the enemy at the distance, where the heavies were coming around that would get the hell out of the way. Even though here we also see likely some sort of progress organization. I mean, Spanish commoners that were levied by the habitual recruitment system that were supposed to be fighting with slings. Right? Now, across all Romano-Germanic Europe, we've seen it recently with some videos about laws of recruitment and so on, the lower strata of the population had historically been the guys equipped with bow and quiver, right? So sometimes you just find quiver, not even the bow, right? It may be a sort of a comprehensive indication that you should have had the bow, but not necessarily even, because let's remember again, there was some sort of tight control, properly as far as the possession of this weapon would go. Of course, peasants, yes, they would have some form of simple bow, etc. But the sense is, in fact, these weapons are sort of the least offensive, effective that you can find. And here, Froissart, however, tells us that not just the Spanish commonality, so he characterizes this not as part of the Spanish commonality. So it's literally the Spanish commoners they made use of slings to which they were accustomed. So it means that there was some local practice in this that had, again, to do with the hypothesis that we made concerning their lifestyle, and from which they threw these large stones. Now, the effect here, according to Froissart, that is sometimes also writing a bit out of fantasy. We traced a profile of the guy who surely knew something about the stories, but he was struck immediately. But he talked, actually, we would like to know more about his sources, but with actual noblemen who had been fighting there, who knew how the battle had gone, etc. And the fact that, again, these stones were big, they were used by the Spanish commonality, and when thrown, they could split a helmet in half, is powerful, right? Especially because Froissart was writing from a very feudal background, at least to please he was a commoner himself, but he was pleasing a nobiliar audience, right? So this seemed like, oh my god, this Spanish, like, look at them, these commoners, they're wild, foreign, whatever, so there's something exotic in that. They have these terrible weapons. They can destroy, can literally break a helmet in half. Now, if that is true, which can be true in general, I mean, especially if you throw, this is not necessarily the case of the Battle of Nayer, but yes, if you throw a stone from especially a certain height difference in distances, so you can really, do a lot, right? A lot. But on a more regular basis, if these weapons were so powerful, it's likely because they were Satff-slings rather than simple slings, right? An ordinary Hand-slung missile could not really split a helmet in half, unless, again, they were throwing it from the tower of a castle. That maybe, right? So Satff-slings are quite powerful because they allow you to use all the, both arms. It's a major, both-handed squash sort of throwing mechanism, and so there's a lot of force there. You can surely throw, especially the hand of somebody without a helmet, into a pulp quite easily. And the Satff-slings are indeed mentioned and illustrated even in a fair number of 14th, 15th century sources. Also, some fully armored men use these weapons. Now, the latter detail is actually not surprising. Men-at-arms had always been skilled in an incredibly effective fashion in every single kind of weapon that exists. I mean, the medieval knight is about this. It's conceived to be better than anybody in every single kind of weapon. There wasn't such a thing like, this weapon was used better by the peasants because they knew it. No, right? The knight mastered it. The reason why people tend to think this is that they stop to humanistic, individualistic perspective, have no idea what the art of war is, nor how these people were actually trained and in which kind of combat they actually got. Because, you should study military history, unfortunately, fortunately, given that it's beautiful, but that's the point, right? Too much work, right? They were trained to fight in every single kind of formation, context, right? From solo, individual combat, fighting in formation on foot, on horseback, and for reasons of, again, of image, we tend not to see what would have been instead rather frequent, that among the different side weapons that the men-at-arms would use. I made a video recently about the seal of Ottokar II of Bohemia, and we observed how certain weapons were just switched, that there were multiple ones hanged on the saddle, etc. There would have been any kind of weapons, including missile ones. Having a crossbow as a side weapon for a knight would have been normal, right? It would have not been anything strange about that. Just they don't show it to you that much. The sling, again, is different, but a men-at-arms would have been definitely skilled in using it at best in every useful situation, right? And there is, in fact, really nothing strange. We will see a little picture. Actually, we can't quote it now. It's the one I think I inserted at the end. That is an illustration from an edition of Froissart from actually the late 15th century. So of course it's not Froissart's times, and it's distant from our times here. But it illustrates a Spanish slinger at Nayer, and he is. Here it is. I have the picture I will upload. He's a heavily armored guy. He has plate armor. The torso definitely displays that. He has coat of mail. You have a full plate armor for his legs. He doesn't have a brigandine. There is a guy that that has it instead on the ground, and the guy also uses a shield in conjunction with the sling, which also makes sense. After all, you can imagine more frequently a buckler being the most common type, in fact, of shield for this extremely light infantry, except in the picture, of course, this guy is supposed to be a much heavier thing, and in fact, it has a much sort of let's say a shield that is meant in many ways to deflect even much heavier weapons in design, etc. He has actually a bolt stuck into it as well, received from an enemy, and he is using his sling, right? It's a bit of a not really fantasistic, but there is some artistically licentious style here. But nevertheless, right, the fact that evidently the guy who had to illustrate Froissart Chronicle was reading from Froissart that there were these slingers, and he wanted to render that from a late 15th century imaginative standpoint. That kind of trooper realized this guy. So this is interesting as far, especially as 15th century warfare is concerned, but we do not have otherwise much of a better picture of what a typical Spanish slinger around, say, the 60s of the 14th century, like at Nayara, would look like. Surely he would have some of the poorest equipment instead, like typically lower class dress, and perhaps no armor whatsoever, except some protection in the form of a shield, right? Going back, however, to Froissart passage about the Spanish slingers, the Battle of Nayara, we comment on the also obvious outcome that a formation of drilled English longbowmen would have, like at least as mercenaries, as generally speaking the indenture system, to become out of experience, would have against these Spanish slingers, that however are able to again inflict severe damage to the English longbowmen before, however, the latter again wipe them out. This is normal, right? The longbow has in many ways it has a greater reach, has a greater sort of here I don't think precision had a lot to do with the situation. In fact, at the beginning you see that's why John I would store all those stones, because the sling was a less powerful weapon than the longbow, but at adequate range you could unload with it a significant amount of power against the enemy right at the first brutal hit. But then on the longer run, the longbowman would have had some advantage, and so this explains a lot of things, if you want, even conceptually, regarding what is that actually makes the best weapon. It doesn't make any sense. It's relative to the employment, right? And not necessarily a less performing weapon is simply worse in a specifically relative condition than another. It's the collective dimension that and the broader employment circumstances that really make the thing, right? And tendentially, of course, these more powerful weapons like the bow in general had been outclassing the sling. Such, there is something, in fact, about the development of the bow just in medieval times that evidently is much greater than the one in antiquity, right? It's maybe a broad statement, but if you consider especially the combined arms factor, right, you do not see among the Celts, the Romans, etc., a great deal of missile warfare compared to the heavy infantry, right? We weren't on any battlefield of antiquity to find out, but we definitely see by the 14th century, looking at the specialization of longbowmen, the selection of them in these increasingly professional systems, in fact, that were actually disarming the rest of the population, right? For these guys to be paid by the nobility to serve in their retinues. The same goes for the crossbows, They are ever more performing technologically. They are monstrous compared to the early ones of antiquity in the early Middle Ages. So you have definitely a major investment in those kind of weapons, also not just technologically, but especially quantitatively, right? There is no doubt that the crossbow conceptually had even taken over the javelin in antiquity. In medieval sources, when you work with them, you often find the term velitas used for the crossbowman. It's a humanistic way of writing, right? But it does mean that, because we do not see so many skirmishers, and wait for that, because now about the Iberian Peninsula we have evidence of them being more present than in other places in Western Europe. But in general, like, those are taken over by the crossbow that act, in fact, as skirmishers as well. I mean, not always. Like, the preferential tactic was using them on the wings to support the infantry, and we will see now how actually things went even at Nayera after the English archers took out the slingers and the other guys on the other missile troops on the flanks. But the point being that not just bows by this time of medieval civilizational advancement have taken over numerically things like the javelin and the sling, but they have also been so virtually it's the universal weapon, right? The English make most of their of the longbow use, but generally speaking, Europe here is uniformly crossbows, right? Except Eastern Europe, where you see more. You see composite bows, you see horse archery, etc., more frequently than in the West, where some of these, for example, longbowmen were mounted at a point just for, not just as bowmen, but that also with the longbow could make the thing slightly complicated, telling the truth, but they could dismount, whatever. That's another thing for another video. But the use of these bows is much more heavily and effortly concerned and channeled and committed to combined arms tactics with much heavier, in fact, elite feudal men-at-arms, both cavalry and infantry. It's as if, in fact, the shock charge had that you do not see in antiquity, right, where you see mostly the bulk of infantry, right? At this point in the Middle Ages, the elite controls more stuff, and so it also concentrates the shock effect, and as such, the missile auxiliaries must be sort of more punching in their own ways. On the wings, to maintain the standards of these forces involved, right? Of course, on the wings you would have heavy infantry as well. I published my share of stuff trying to explain, because we do not really know how, aside from those missile troops that would be stationed in the front and retreat before the main engagement, would actually interact with the wings, right? And because it's never quite explicitated. There are some ideas, I have my own, but let's say it's all also not explicitated clearly. But evidently, again, the bow has developed in ways that basically are much more matching the same level of cavalry quality and dynamism. So much more heavily combined arms tactics. There would be a lot to discuss about this compared to the ancient world, but this is the impression I heavily received from my background. So speaking of missiles, of the slingers, you can imagine not just stones, but things like bars of iron, lead balls, and even fire grenades. Yes, there was that articulated. The sling actually does offer you all those options. There is not much of a great, you know, ballistic and aerodynamic, you know, let's say limit like it would happen with a bow, but at the same time, this is because you're sort of modulating way more the way the projectile is shot properly in the way you use your arms doing so, or the single one, depending whether you're using the simple, the Satff-sling and the simple one, respectively. But bars of iron obviously are designed to hit lead balls to cause significant damage physically to metal armor. Right, the same goes with stones. Some of them are terrifying. Fire grenades, at this point, you can't imagine what the broader purpose could be in general. So we're talking about pretty nasty stuff. But it does seem that the average weapon, as we've seen produced in the tens of thousands, as issued by the Saint John I of Castile, would be the stone. Right, a stone cut also in a certain way. Of course, the slingers would have at that point been able to cast their projectiles in the preferential way, or at least to make it better than, let's say, than an average stone in some way, and their craft is somehow hidden as far as the info is concerned. But understand there is not too many. In case of emergency, everything you can throw that with a certain force can do, right, to smash somebody's head, especially. As we were saying before, the normal battle array of these troops was being drawn up in the front. Part of the reason in Spain was due to the fact that there was, again, more mounted archery of some kind, or javeliners at some point as well, that thus was grouped like on the wings, and it would have been sort of more complicated to interact with slingers, especially if these were sent in vanguard as expendables, right? It could have been run over by their own horsemen. They were surely more important and sort of having greater relevance even than some what normal infantry would do, at least on the wings. This is debatable, because at the end of the day, these were mostly just light horsemen to some extent, but this really depends on the single battle, on the single formation. I have made some videos about Spanish battles of the same period, and we've seen how tendentially they followed the idea of the various battles on a single line, differently from formations in depth like you find more often in France or Italy, or the same England in this time. But it really depends on the situation, because otherwise the same Spanish armies were often deployed in the same way in the three battles in depth. At least I have to check this, but I did it firsthand from the actual battles, but I did find it, studied, so I think it's fairly reliable. And after all, there weren't many other ways to fight a battle, right? It's either in line or in column, right? And so this, again, where it swings depends on the terrain, on the types of enemy. If you fear to be outflanked, of course, and there is a lot of broken terrain in some circumstances, you would opt better for these battles on the on a single line, right? Whereas if it's a more frontal thing, you have the typically tidy corridor, right? At best you can have flank attacks from concealed small parties, but overall it's a frontal alternation of the battle lines. And again, in Spain things are a bit more dynamic, so the idea that the first case, at least I found that in some battles, is apparently more frequent, at least than the Western average, may be an interesting point to start from. Interestingly enough, the slingers were not the only type of relatively anachronistic troopers. used in the Iberian Peninsula, there were the javelin men on foot as well. The Spanish would use the crossbowmen in the front ranks. This is something, I don't know, the French did, depending, however, on the type of target. The idea, the Spanish armies probably had to screen a little bit more from in the front to sort of see better where the fight would go, because of that aforementioned mobility is sort of fitting. When you look at the French sending their crossbows ahead, it's mostly just because they either wanted to sort of dislodge an enemy that was entrenched and or didn't have that great mobility that the major army had. I'm thinking about the Battle of Courtrai, thinking about battles like in part even the Crecy, but at that point actually these forces would have been deployed on the flanks as well. And this is in part the same case of Nayarit, where we do find actually another form of deployment with the slingers behind the cavalrymen on the flanks. In fact, in these circumstances, it said that the English archers took out the javelin-armed jinetes, right, who were outranged by their opponents, which also kind of makes a lot of sense because they were just javeliners that longbowmen could shoot at much greater range. And in fact, drove both them and the infantry crossbowmen and slingers who followed them up, right, from the field. And this is a quite relevant information because it shows, at least in this case, that the Spanish were using, these were the Castilians fighting against the English, these slingers on the wings, essentially supporting from behind the missile cavalry. Actually, here we do not have a proof of their actual interaction. It would have not been so strange, especially considering here mounted javeliners are so accustomed to come pretty close to the enemy to see maybe the slingers following these guys, because these were acting in open order, evidently, as missile troops. So there could be a bit of, of loose, say, they would act in open order, a loose formation, and they could not really run over one another, but still there would have been an initial cohesion, and so the sense is that the slingers were behind, again, to prevent the sort of accidents of the jinetes running over them. Right. In any case, these slingers and the infantry crossbowmen were just behind those jinetes, and we do not know even in this case what kind of interaction there was among them. Surely they couldn't simply, you see, for example, the Spanish had crossbowmen, but they used them behind the javeliners. So the sense is that the javelin actually at a short range has a pretty strong punching capacity, right? But it has to get there. If you have in front of you some bowmen, they can be knocked out. So given that this would have been the normality if the same Spanish had crossbow, and I think that the accounts should be examined a bit more carefully, because the impression is that maybe there was some, that we do not know how they actually interacted precisely, and not necessarily what really happened on this battlefield as far as the position of this troop was concerned. But the most important datum is, however, that these troops were on the wings, because at that point the English of the book Percy and Clisson were able to move ahead and attacking the French, because here the French were allied with the Castilians, were fighting there together. The French vanguard's exposed flanks, right? This is relevant because it shows what the purpose of the wings really was. Also, as far as the longbowmen in the army of the Black Prince in this battle, I made a video also about the Battle of Poitiers. The point was knocking out the enemy wings so that you could fall with your own wings on the enemy battle flanks, while they were engaged, of course, with your own heavies in the front. And this is pretty much a standard tactics that you do find very often in Western Europe from the 13th century. I actually specialize exactly in it. If you're interested, actually, you'll probably find out who I am at this point. But the point mostly being that these armies' tactics were all pretty similar. And so what is fascinating in this case is the Spanish, again, using mounted missile cavalry, which is something you do not really see instead in this other Western European armies, where you do have, again, mounted crossbowmen normally among them, but not quite. In open field there is a prevalence of heavy infantry and essentially bowmen, right? That I think we operated fundamentally behind the infantry. So actually, also in this case, between the a Hineta attack and another, surely the crossbows may have shot over their head, right, with no risk of any significant friendly fire, and so there would be a sort of hit and run tactics, and this seems sort of the most reasonable way of thinking that. But the sling is relatively less performing in that, so it's more difficult to accomplish that feat. Okay, not excessively, but let's say slings are clumsier than especially crossbows in terms of accuracy, etc. So and also they have a shorter range. So the idea is that the slingers were probably jumping around, where another more at least than the crossbows would normally do. And again, the relation with this Jinetes is sort of more complex. We will make a video about the Battle of Nayer, but I think that there is currently no study that sheds light on this topic, because probably it's not even explicitated, or you cannot get there from the sources unless you study all the Spanish battles of the period, which would be really interesting to do. And I started a little bit on my own. I made a video about the Battle of Rio Salado, 1340. It is pretty close here, and that's interesting because it's the one that I was describing before mentally when talking about the battles deployed in a single line. But it was also about the terrain, different valleys, and the armies fear to be outflanked by each other. We're talking about essentially a coalition of Castilians and Portuguese against the Marinids and the Sultanate of Granada. And it was a Christian victory, brought an end to the invasion from the Marinid side. They wanted to come back to Spain, like sort of reestablishing like a significant power from North Africa, as late as 1340, right? I have to re-upload that, but with copyright-free images, but you have actually the entire battle laid out. So if you're interested to see how they actually fought, you realize that these Jinetes units were quite flexible. They in that particular formation, it would be quite crucial to not just interact more habitually, like in separated fights between these single battles frontally against one another, but also linking up the others. And it was very difficult in this circumstance because the terrain was terrifying. There were again all valleys, not an open ground, whatever. So they fought essentially something like 2 or even 3 separated battles in the engagements in each in their own sectors, with different outcomes, or almost at least. This was actually a crucial victory of the Christians, but they obviously risked till the last moment to lose, as every battle that is yet to be fought, finished to be fought at least, really goes. We have an interesting source that is Chandos Herald, talking about 14th century Spanish foot soldiers that are specifically Castilian infantry at the Nayara. It says that they were equipped as crossbowmen, villains, and varlets with lances and sharp darts and slings to throw stones, right? And it's interesting to see the sharp darts used as probably something like this. This is a javelin, of some sort, right? And of course the slings. And so again, there are these, you see, especially foreign observers that say, this Spanish infantry fights in a way that we haven't quite seen that often. For the record, the Ottomans would still use slings against roads as late as 1480, right? Just to point out again how frequent it would be. I don't know, for some Anatolian shepherd that mobilized against, the knights of Rhodes to just going at war with that weapon of his, right? But not only, as we've seen, these weapons would be used by actually a wider range of troops, some of which were not just again specialized in it. It is a weapon, admittedly, that you must know how to use in a functional sense, and especially when you fight in, say, it doesn't matter how loose formation, but still in a way again that must be consistent in terms of heaviness. You can learn to use a crossbow in a few months, well, right? A longbow is much more complicated. A sling is also complicated, so you need mostly people who know how to use it in a progressed way. This could have been learned in the military, as we've seen with the men-at-arms, because of the way they were brought up and they worked normally, or by this, again, shepherds, more preferentially, that were just skilled in that, peasants, people who even hunted with them, and so that when brought together in some units could form, without too many presences, this sort of heavy fire against the enemy in loose order, but still all together enough to be consistent, right? To be heavy, concentrated, and as we've seen, pretty nasty in many ways. And there would be different types of slings too. So again, I don't want to leave you with the concept that just a shepherd knew how to use a weapon or like this, or but preferentially. And the reason part why we highlight the Iberian background here is exactly this one, is exactly the fact that the Iberian Peninsula had sort of more areas that would provide with some sort of background that would have habituated you to the sling, mostly from a pastoral background. That's the point. And just as a poor weapon that, however, you would need at some point, there is something about again, the relatively rustic background of Castile, but also the presence of some communes that were, again, not as developed, for example, not so gentrified like the ones in other parts of Western Europe, that sort of were in fact more rural as well, and thus would also have in the local militias perhaps a greater amount of slings. Right, that's the idea. And again, there were all the variety of projectiles of types, so this would have surely corresponded to different ways these communities were habituated to that specifically. And I think it makes sense. I think it's the more balanced explanation, right? Because it's a mix between sort of an updated military and something coming with, say, from the background, requiring at least the support of some important levies from contexts that again were not so demilitarized for example, in most extensively controlled agricultural areas like France, for example, by the greater lordships and so on. The Kingdom of Castile had a quite complex territory, made multiple videos about that, and so some communities would maintain an autonomy in the mountains, in some, in plateaus, etc., that would bring these guys to provide with this kind of troops, and the same Kingdom of Castile would issue the production of specifically cast stones for sling use, with Satff-sling for Satff-sling as well, and again the nasty weapon. However, not as performing as the dominating bows that were much, at this point were taking over. So these are basically some, aside from the episodic mentions that we also remember here. We've seen the Grenadines in southern Spain kept using that. We've seen the Turks even. Again, the English and the French sources are a bit like, that's new, that's something different from us. And yes, again, Iberian warfare has its own specificities, its own, let's say, in fact, really characteristics that are very specific of a system that was essentially contained within itself. It was, in a way, even separated from the rest of Western Europe as a military system on its own. And so this more also hit-and-run tactics, skirmishing capacity, etc., that they knew their deal, right? And so the slingers were importantly effective, and we will see them for 13th century, 15th century warfare as well, perhaps in another video. Today I decided to typologize this type of Castilian slinger of the 14th century, referring mostly to the Battle of Nayera, the accounts of Froissart and other sources. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.